Welcome back, everybody, to the Pauper Metagame. I'm your host, MSP, aka Making Smart Plays. And today we're going to cover a truly Tier 1 Pauper deck, Kuldotha Boros. Now, first of all, for those of you who are paying attention, been playing Pauper for a while, really understand the format, you're going to rail at me for saying this is Kuldotha Boros, because it's not really Kuldotha Boros. Kuldotha Boros actually is actually different, but what happened was we had two different styles of Boros decks that developed that had a lot of the same cards, but one was more control oriented and the other one was more aggressive. The control version seems to have won out as the more popular / more successful deck, and it doesn't even have the original Kuldotha card in it, but everybody just calls it Kuldotha Boros anyway. So this is technically not Kuldotha Boros, but everybody calls it Kuldotha Boros anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and call it Kuldotha Boros. Most importantly, if you look this thing up on MTG Goldfish, it's going to be called Kuldotha Boros. So anyway, let's get right into it. This is sort of a white-red mid-rangey deck. It's got a little more aggression than most control decks, but it is fairly control-oriented. So in the creature package, we're running Glinthawk, Thraben Inspector, Core Skyfisher, and Palace Sentinels. So the Palace Sentinels, they give you the Monarch token, and what this deck is really trying to do is land a Palace Sentinels, get the Monarch token, prevent your opponent from being able to get in for combat damage. Because once you have that Monarch token, you draw an extra card every turn as long as your opponent can't deal any combat damage to you. You can just keep your opponent basically at a disadvantage because you're getting 2 cards every turn. And, short of any card draw aspects they might have in their deck, they're just getting the 1 card every turn. And, of course, over the course of 10-12 turns, that is a lot of extra cards. So that's what this deck is trying to do. What this deck has going for it is it's got a lot of other little synergies along the way. It's got Glinthawk, Core Skyfisher. These are both cards that allow the deck to pick up Alchemist File and Prophetic Prism. So Alchemist File is a 2 casting cost artifact, and you get to draw a card when it comes into play. Prophetic Prism, also, you get to draw a card when it comes into play. So the Alchemist File, also, you can sacrifice it, pay 1, and prevent a creature from attacking you or blocking, but what you really care about is dropping a Palace Sentinels, getting the Monarch token, having a few blockers out so your opponent can't bang through to get your Monarch token, and even if your opponent comes up with some removal or jumps through some hoops, you've got Alchemist Vial insurance, so that at the end of the day, if your deck is working ideally, you're not really leaning on the Alchemist Vial, but it's there to be insurance, so that if your opponent thinks they're going to get to jam through, you can shut them down and say, nope, I'm keeping the Monarch token. Anyway, you can utilize both Glinthawk and Core Skyfisher in combination with your Alchemist File and your Prophetic Prism to be able to get some extra cantrips. And cantripping flyers aren't bad. Now, admittedly, it's kind of dirtily. Like, when you play a Glinthawk, you're paying 1 mana for a 2/2 flyer. It allows you to pick up an artifact. So then you pick up your Alchemist File and you recast it for another 2 mana. So what you're doing is you're paying 3 mana for a 2/2 flyer that draws you a card, which is not bad. It's not the most amazing busted thing of all time, but it's not bad. And this is basically what the white-red deck does. It does a lot of this kind of stuff. You can also utilize not only can you use the Core Skyfisher in combination with the Alchemist File and the Prophetic Prism, but if you really want to do some absurd dirtling, you play a Thraben Inspector, so you get a clue, then you pick it up with a Core Skyfisher, then you redrop your Thraben Inspector and get another clue. This is a little ridiculous because Core Skyfisher is a 2/3 flyer that costs 2 mana, and then when you recast your Thraben Inspector, now we're up to 3 mana. And then when you activate your clue, you're up to 5 mana. So you're basically paying 5 mana for a 2/3 that draws a card. That is some absurd, inefficient dirtling. But, when you have a bunch of mana and you don't have a lot of cards, usually you're willing to spend however much mana you have to get any extra cards. And in the early game, if you've got, tons of cards and not a lot of mana, you can do other things. That's where the deck balances out its mana efficiency by having a pretty efficient removal package. 4 Lightning Bolts, 4 Galvanic Blast. This is pretty standard stuff. Sometimes you'll see some other miscellaneous red removal thrown in there. This deck is running in 1 Electrickery in the main deck. probably as a way of paying respect to both elves and mono blue and blue red Delver decks that are out there right now. Electrickery does well against all of that stuff, and that's all some pretty good, popular, powerful stuff at the moment. So I think the main deck Electrickery is fine. But yeah, you'll see other random various things as well. I've also pulled up another list. These are both 6.0 lists from Magic Online, and it's running 4 Galvanic Blast and 4 Lightning Bolt, but it does not have a copy of Electrickery in the main. So there's different ways you can do this. The deck also does not have any other removal options either. But at any rate, getting back to this first list we were working off of, in addition to all of that, having I think 3 copies of Prismatic Strands that's pretty heavy. But both of these lists seem to be running 3 copies. I would think 2 copies personally would be sufficient, but again, both of these decks went 6.0, so what do I know? A couple of copies of Battle Screech, that's pretty standard, makes sense. Battle Screech is just there basically because it's the ability to pick up 4 1/1 flyers off of 4 mana and 1 card. So at the end of the day, mana wise, you're paying 1 mana per flyer. So it's 1 mana for a 1/1 flyer and getting 4 of them all out of 1 card. It's just a sweet value. And Battle Screech occupies an interesting place in the deck because having all those flyers allows you to muck up the board so your opponent can't get an efficient attack through to steal your Monarch token. But once you turn the corner, that's a nice little, like if you have a Battle Screech, you get all 4 1/1 tokens out, and you've got a Core Skyfisher, you're now attacking for 6 damage a turn flying. So Battle Screech also helps you to close out the game once you get firm control. The rest of the removal, Journey to Nowhere helps to take care of creatures that get too big for the burn to be able to deal with. So 3 copies of Journey to Nowhere. So as you can see, both of these lists are fairly similar. One of these lists is running 3 Palace Sentinels, another list is running 2 Palace Sentinels, and has this spicy Seeker of the Way action thrown in here. Seeker of the Way is a 2 mana 2/2, has prowess, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Seeker of the Way gets lifelink. What's relevant to note here is it's not just instants and sorceries, it's any non-creature spell. That means when you drop an Alchemist Vial or Prophetic Prism or a Journey to Nowhere, any artifact or enchantment, Seeker of the Way gets lifelink. So this is nice against burn and super aggressive decks coming at you. It's always nice to battle back with lifelink. So it's not necessarily clear what's better because again, both of these lists did well, and there's certainly versions with and without Seeker of the Way that seem to be doing well. So it probably just has a lot to do with what kind of matchups you run into. Anyway, moving along to the land. So the standard land package, we've got some artifact lands. We've got 4 copies of the bounce lands. Usually there's a few cycling lands sprinkled in. And not a whole lot of basics, usually a couple of basics. Radiant Fountains in there for some extra life gain. And then, usually a few Windscarred Crag. This version's running the 4 Windscarred Crag. A few things to point out here on the more subtle side. Because we're running Glinthawk, which requires you to return an artifact to your hand when you play it, there will be those, odd situations where you don't have an Alchemist Vial or a Prophetic Prism, and you don't really want to wait for the card value because you're going up against the aggro deck. You just need to get a 2/2 blocker out there. Or for whatever reason you feel like you need to be aggressively getting a 2/2 flyer out there to attack with. Whatever the case may be, having access to Ancient Den and Great Furnace allows you to get your Glinthawk out even when you're not hitting any other artifacts. So that's one reason to actually have some artifact lands. The other reason is Galvanic Blast. You want to have a critical mass of artifacts so you can hit Metalcraft and do 4 damage to a creature or player instead of 2. And 4 is a very critical amount of damage. It allows you to take out Spire Golems, opposing Palace Sentinels, Penumbra Spiders, all kinds of random stuff that clocks in at 4 toughness. So that is not inconsequential. Pretty much a good number of the creatures in Affinity are 4/4 creatures, so going from 2 damage to 4 damage with consistency is very important. So that's also why we've got these artifacts lands in here. The reason for the Radiant Fountains to have this little extra supplemental life gain helps against aggro, also very nice against burn, because What you can do against a burn deck is you can use your core Skyfishers instead of being 2 mana for a 2/3 that you use some shenanigans with to pick up an artifact and replay it to get an extra card of value. Instead, you just pick up a Radiant Fountain and drop it back on the board, so you get a 2/3 flyer that set you back a land but help you gain 2 life, basically. And that's pretty good when you're going up against burn. If you hit a Radiant Fountain and 2 core Skyfishers and you're able to gain 4 extra life there, and then you got your Prismatic Strands, and then you got some Windscarred Crags. Every little point of life can make a huge difference against burn, and of course the Prismatic Strands can be a real blowout versus burn. So when you add it all up, this white-red deck actually has pretty good game against burn, even though it might not be completely obvious, and that's completely without the Seeker of the Way. If you manage to get a Seeker of the Way down and protect it, that's going to be a big blowout. But even with the versions that don't run Seeker of the Way, with careful game management, you can eke out enough life gain to get the W. So beyond that, one other thing worth pointing out is because you have these cycling lands, the Secluded Steppe and the Forgotten Cave, you're running 21 land, so you're not super land heavy, but you're not super land light, so being able to cycle those lands out helps. Also, because most of these lists run 3 or 4 copies of Boros Garrison, it's a cute play to be able to drop your cycling land early in the game because you need the mana, and then in the mid to late game you hit a Boros Garrison, you tap your Forgotten Cave for mana, you drop a Boros Garrison, you pick up your Forgotten Cave, and then cycle it with the mana that you activated from tapping it. So basically, having the Boros Garrisons lets you sort of get those cycling lands back and then cycle them out to get you fresh cards. So that's just a bounce land, cycling land, not really amazing tech, but there's not really any amazing tech in this deck. I think that the bouncing a cycling land with a bounce land to get a card really defines how this deck operates, in this sense that you're not doing anything fundamentally broken. You're just utilizing a lot of these little marginal synergies to give you a couple of points of life here, a couple extra cards there, a few extra points of damage there. And this is typically enough to get there if you're piloting it well and you're drawing decent. The deck has a lot of good matchups. The Radiant Fountain, also, again, you can pick that up with the Boros Garrison and drop it again. This is nice against aggro decks, burn decks, that kind of stuff. Both of these 6-0 lists that I'm going over here have pretty similar main decks. The only real major difference besides the Seeker of the Way is that this version right here has 1 copy of Bojuka Bog in the main deck. And this, it's one of those things where, having a tap land that doesn't add relevant mana for most of what you're doing. Admittedly, this deck also has a copy of Reaping the Graves in the sideboard, and we'll come back to that in a minute as well. But for the most part, the Bojuka Bog is not providing you with red or white mana. Also, of course, we've got Prophetic Prism, so we can filter anything out into the colors that we need. But again, baseline, your opening hand has a Bojuka Bog and a Radiant Fountain, and that's it for mana. I mean, that's a mulligan. Whereas if you had a Radiant Fountain and a Mountain or a Plains, that may very well have been a keepable hand. So running the Bojuka Bog is not at all without cost. In fact, if you look at one of the differences in the land setup between this version and the other version, this version's running 3 Windscarred Crags, a dual land. Instead of running the 4 like the other deck is, it's running 3 and a Bojuka Bog. So Bojuka Bog in this list, you could effectively argue, is taking the slot of a dual land. And if you hit a dual land and a Radiant Fountain, that's definitely a keeper for almost any type of hand that you're going to come up with, because you have enough cheap, efficient stuff you can cast that if you've got both the colors you need and 2 mana, you should be good to go. So the Bojuka Bog, what I'm trying to say is it's not being included here without a cost. It also comes into play tapped. So there's downside. Now the sweet upside to this is now you've got main deck Graveyard Hate, which is not irrelevant at all. This particular version has 1 Relic of Progenitus in the sideboard. I think the other version also just has the 1 copy. Yeah, both versions running 1 copy of Relic Progenitus. So if you think about it, while we sacrifice a little bit of consistency, because of Bojuka Bog being a tap land and not providing appropriate colors of mana, what we gain is twice the amount of graveyard hate. And there's a ton of graveyard activity, even though there may not be a ton of all-in graveyard decks in Pauper. There's tons of decks that have some measure of extra value they're getting out of the graveyard. So this is not irrelevant. Also, because of the Boros garrisons, one Bojuka Bog being replayed 2 or 3 times over the course of a game to eat your opponent's graveyard 2 or 3 times is really not as uncommon as somebody might think. So even though we're just adding 1 copy of Bojuka Bog to the deck, you can get a lot of value out of it because of your bounce lands. And this is one of the interesting things about running bounce lands. Obviously, you know, coming into play tapped is the downside, but the addition of the Bojuka Bog sort of adds a certain modular nature to your bounce lands, where depending on what the matchup is, it gives you a little bit of a toolbox going on where, you know, you've got your life gain bouncing for burn decks. You could cycle out your cycling lands and bounce those if you're more concerned about keeping up with cards. Or you can bounce your Bojuka Bog if you're more important with hating on your opponent's graveyard. So when you have lands that there's value in picking them up and either replaying them or doing something with them, it really just makes your Boros garrisons all the more synergistic with those options. So anyway, that's really, you know, those are really the only differences between these two decks. Pretty similar core. When we get into the sideboard, we also see a lot of similarities. Again, as I pointed out, there's a copy of Reaping the Graves in the sideboard here. It's not bad. Again, not only can you cast that with the Bojuka Bog, but we have 4 copies of Prophetic Prism. So even though we don't have any swamps in this deck, it's not that big of a deal. It shouldn't be too hard to cast this Reaping the Graves off of the 5 black sources that are available to the deck. This is not bad. This is mostly to be included when you go up against another mid-range or control deck, because in the mid to late game, you're able to pop off Reaping the Graves, and if you get back a couple of Skyfishers, a Thraben Inspector, and a Palace Sentinels, I mean, you can certainly do some work and get a lot of value, particularly if you're bringing back Thraben Inspectors, Glint Hawks, and Core Skyfishers and using those to draw even more cards after that. So yeah, Reaping the Graves, you can certainly get a lot of value out of that. Core Sanctifiers is there to blow up artifacts and enchantments. Probably the most straightforward application of this comes in against Affinity and Boggles, where being able to kill artifacts and enchantments could definitely win you the game. Now, this is only going to come online at 4 mana, because it costs 3 mana to play it, 1 mana for the kicker to blow up your artifact or enchantment. So by turn 4 against Affinity, you know, you better be holding off your opponent a little bit. But you know, you really need to hit some Journey to Nowheres or some Galvanic Blasts, basically is what it boils down to. Otherwise, by the time Core Sanctifier gets going, you may already be dead. But if you can get some other removal options to get you there, the fun thing about the Core Sanctifiers is you can pick them back up with the Core Skyfishers and, you know, chain a few different activations, which is really nice against both Boggles, Affinity, and a number of other decks. Standard Bearer is a card that's fantastic against Boggles. It's good against Mono White Heroic. It's good against Elves. It's good against a lot of different things. That, you know, it's pretty decent against Stompy. Anything that's going to be pumping up creatures through activated abilities or instants, it's just going to be money, and it could win the game all by itself. Lone Missionary is particularly good against, you know, like mono red aggro, or against burn, the ability to just gain 4 life, and then if you can replay it off a Core Skyfisher, even more value. But just gaining 4 life against burn is going to be really good. Against a red deck that has attacking creatures and burn, being able to gain 4 life and then trade off for another 2/2 creature is sweet value as well. Relic of Progenitus, just a little more graveyard hate. Pyroblast comes in because that way at least you can fight back against blue decks, be able to take out any blue card in a mono blue Delver, and also at least have some way to interact with blue's counter spells. Since we're playing basically a mid-rangey, you know, / controlling style deck that doesn't have any counter magic, so when we do run up against control decks that do have counter magic, Pyroblast can help even things out a little bit. Gorilla Shaman, main application here is against Affinity, which we do really have to respect because this deck is not as good against Affinity as you might think. Again, we do have the Gorilla Shamans and the Core Sanctifiers in the sideboard. In the main deck, we do have a lot of things that we do have a lot of speed bumps that we can throw out there. Thraben Inspectors, if we get a Battle Screech online, you could block with a 1/1 and then use a Bolt to kill a 4/4 creature. But the problem is, as far as straight up stone cold removal that deals with a lot of their threats, we basically have the 3 Journey to Nowheres and the 4 Galvanic Blasts, and 7 copies of removal in a 60 card deck does not give you enough consistency to really effectively deal with one of their really explosive hands, you know, all the time. I'm not saying the matchup is bad, because especially once you go to sideboard, this deck has some really nice answers. It's just that you might look at this and go, oh wow, this deck looks like it's going to blow out Affinity every time. That's just not the case. If Affinity gets an explosive hand and you're not, and you get an average distribution draw, there's a very reasonable chance Affinity is going to win that on game 1. So it's one of those matchups that could really go either way, and the draws really do make a big difference. But anyway, the Gorilla Shamans are, I think, a necessary inclusion in the sideboard to help tilt the scales a little bit more. So I don't think this is overkill by any stretch. Then we have Electrickery again to deal with elves, Delver decks, and all that kind of stuff. Looking over at our other decks, our other 6-0 list that we're working off of, 3 copies of Electrickery. We don't have any in the main, but the deck sort of compensates by saying that, you know, if Electrickery is good, now we got 3 copies in the sideboard to really bring the hate. Again, 2 copies of Gorilla Shaman, 4 copies of Pyroblast, 1 copy of Relic of Progenitus, 2 copies of Standard Bearer. Now here's where we get our little spicy change-up, Molten Rain. Molten Rain is primarily here to deal with Tron, because when White-Red goes up against Tron, there's a reasonable chance you need a little something to tip the scales, because the Tron decks have access to a boatload of mana. And whenever you have 2 clashing control decks, or 2 clashing mid-range decks, or a mid-range deck and a control deck, you know, whichever deck can basically capitalize on having more mana to work with is going to do very well. If you've ever watched, you know, some big, you know, Pro Tour or Grand Prix stream where you watch 2 control decks go up against each other, you could probably see for yourself or hear the commentators talk about how vitally important it is in the control versus control game for both, you know, for both players to hit their land drops, and how missing your land drops in those matchups can be devastating. And it's just one of those things when you have, you know, 2 decks that are trying to go the long game, the one that has more mana has a huge advantage. So Molten Rain can sort of help White-Red claw back into that matchup. I think Tron is a rough matchup otherwise, just because they're going a much more abusive long game than what White-Red is doing. White-Red actually has enough aggression that, you know, if you get a quick Glint Hawk and a quick Core Skyfisher, and then you get a Battle Screech online, and you're getting in there, and the next thing you know, they're down to 12, and you double Galvanic Blast, and boom, you've won the game. So the nice thing about the Red-White Boros deck is that it has the ability to actually turn the corner and play the aggressive role much better than what a lot of other mid-range or control decks are able to do. So this deck has a lot more ability to kind of choose what kind of game plan it's going to operate on, to be more controlling, to hang back, try to block, try to grind out advantage with Palace Sentinels. It also has the option to try to be more aggressive, to be attacking and shoving in and burning your opponent out. It's just important to be mindful, you know, which direction you're going to be going, and thinking about the matchup, whether or not you're the beatdown deck or where you fall. Along those lines, it's also probably worth mentioning how the Palace Sentinels are a very good card against Tron, because most Tron lists don't have a ton of creatures, and most Tron lists also are not like chock full of counterspells, so they have to be very selective about how they use their counterspells. And when you go to remove their creatures, they're usually not going to use their counterspells on your removal. So it's not that hard to actually lock in the Monarch token lock even against Tron with a Palace Sentinel. You just wait until an opportune time when they have to tap out to move their game state forward, jam a Palace Sentinels, or if it's in a post-board game, you know, get to 5 mana so you can back up a Palace Sentinels with a Pyroblast in a situation where you're fairly sure they don't have more than one counterspell available because of mana or playing other cards or whatever. But if you can get Palace Sentinels on board, they don't have a lot of creatures to attack you back, so it's fairly easy for you to maintain that Monarch token. The one downside here, and this is again the problem with Tron, is that Tron has so much mana and so many ways to draw cards that you could actively have the Monarch token on the board, and the Tron deck will draw more cards than you do without the Monarch token, because Tron can do ridiculous things when it has that much mana. Being able to ghostly flicker, a Muldrifter over and over and over, it doesn't take much to be able to draw an absurd amount of cards. So I don't think that the Molten Rain here is a terrible call. One thing I do want to give a shout out to, though, is Earthrift. So Earthrift costs 4 mana instead of 3 mana. It does not do the 2 points of damage. And Earthrift in return has a flashback option at 7 mana to destroy target land. So I don't know that Earthrift is actually better than Molten Rain in this space, because in the Tron matchup, being able to get the extra 2 points of damage is actually not irrelevant, even though doing damage to our opponent directly might not be all that relevant if we're going up against, say, an aggro deck, because we are trying to be the more aggressive deck against Tron when we're playing the red-white deck. Molten Rain's 2 damage is relevant. Getting it off on turn 3 is also relevant, because somewhere in that time frame is probably when Tron is going to come online, and you want to nip that in the bud right away if you can. Also, depending on what type of Tron deck you're up against, there could be a question mark. If it's Denrovatron, they might lock you out before you ever even get to 7 mana. But the reason I wanted to talk about Earthrift was because if you got 3 copies of Molten Rain and you blow up one of their Tron pieces, the problem is if you're not killing them fast enough, a lot of times Tron will be able to reassemble Tron. That's just happens time and time again, where you'll be so excited that you blew up one of their Tron pieces, and lo and behold, they just fish up another piece, and boom, they've got Tron online again. And meanwhile, you only had 3 copies of Molten Rain, and you only drew 1 copy, so now they're just off to the races. The other problem is because a lot of them run fog effects, they can shut down your ability to aggro them out quickly enough. The thing that's kind of nice about Earthrift is a lot of the time the game will go long enough for you to get to 7 mana. And if you've got 3 copies of Earthrift in your sideboard, then you do have access to blowing up 6 Tron lands instead of just 3. I mean, you're doubling up on your ability to kill the Tron lands. The downside again, though, is by the time we get 7 mana out, the game may already be over anyway. So I'm not saying that Earthrift is the call here. I think that Molten Rain probably may actually be the more optimal choice, but whenever I do these deck techs, I like to throw out other random variables that could be considered, and Earthrift is one of those really obscure pieces of tech that some people don't even know about. Most people who have been involved in Pauper for long enough probably remember the days when everything was Locust decks versus other Locust decks, and having Earthrift was really important. But anyway, yeah, that pretty much covers it. That's our deep dive deck tech for Kuldotha Boros. As far as breaking down the deck list, I will take a minute here just to kind of go through a quick breakdown of some of the metagame matchups. Izzet Delver is kind of a 50-50 matchup. A lot of it, again, and this is going to be true for a lot of different matchups, being able to jam your Palace Sentinels and then keep your opponent from dealing damage to you is just really important. One of the reasons why I think one of these copies runs 2 Palace Sentinels and the other version runs 3 is if you're behind, Palace Sentinels is not going to help you, because if your opponent has more creatures than you and they're attacking you, you drop a Palace Sentinels, all you're doing is giving your opponent the Monarch token. So it's not a very good come from behind card. But you will see some of these lists running 3 or 4 copies of Palace Sentinels because it's so good that you definitely want to draw it at a relevant early point in the game if you can. So there's definitely some tension there as far as really wanting to draw it early. You don't necessarily want multiple copies, and you don't want to draw it when you're behind. So that's kind of some of the tension with Palace Sentinels. The thing about Delver is Because it's a tempo deck, it can get out there early. They can play a Spell Stutter Sprite at the end of your turn and then attack in with it in the air. You do have flying blockers. You do have cheap removal. Boros has a lot of the right answers and counterplay to both Delver decks to give it a real fighting chance. It's kind of a 50-50 matchup. They're both really good decks. And I don't know which deck I want to be holding. I think it's such a 50-50 matchup that a lot of it just comes down to sideboards and how many copies of Electrickery you've got, how many Pyroblasts you've got, those kind of things. Against Tron, you're definitely playing the aggressive role and sticking a Pal. You can really just almost mindlessly jam Palace Sentinels. I say almost because they might actually have a couple of Mull Drifters they can attack you with, but the Tron list typically runs so few creatures that you don't have to be as worried about your opponent attacking you and stealing your Monarch token. So being able to jam the Palace Sentinels on turn 4 is huge against Tron because it's going to take them a long time to have any chance of taking your Monarch token. Meanwhile, you just want to beat them in the face and save as much of your burn to go to the dome as you can, and definitely board in whatever graveyard hate that you have. Mono Blue Delver, basically already covered it talking about Is It Delver. Blue-black control is interesting. You have to remember they've got counterspells. If they're running Gurmag Anglers, you really have to think about how you're going to deal with them because your burn package won't do anything, and that means you're basically going to have to rely on your Journey to Nowheres. But don't forget that you can use one of your 2-power creatures to block a Gurmag Angler and then bolt it off the board to get in your 5 damage. But also, if you're going to do that, you have to be mindful of the fact that your opponent could utilize a counter spell to foil your plan. So the biggest downside here in the matchup is it's basically we're playing a control-ish style deck against another control-ish style deck, but they have counter spells. The upside is we have a lot more aggression usually that we can deploy, and we have actually a lot more flyers. Even though we're white-red and they're blue, a lot of these blue-black control decks, if they have any flyers at all, they're basically going to be running Delvers, and some of the truly blue-black controlling lists don't even have Delvers. So being able to establish the real aggressive threat in the air is nice. Also because we have the Battle Screech, a lot of these blue-black control lists are utilizing things like Chainer's Edict, and the Battle Screech is quite nice against that. Against Elves, Electrickery is the name of the game. Being able to remove off the really dangerous Elves is important. So you really you don't want to kill every Llanowar elf that hits the board. If they've only got one forest and you can lock them out for several turns by killing their mana elves to keep them from really getting going, great. But otherwise, you want to prioritize your removal on the elves that are really going to kill you. They're elvish vanguards and so forth. Quirion Ranger is really something to keep an eye on too, as one of the creatures that actually may seem innocent, but it doubles up on making a lot of their other elves more powerful that do have activated abilities. But overall, frankly, I'd rather be playing the red-white deck against elves, just because if you're able to get off to a good start and you've got a good hand, Electrickery can definitely get you there. Mono-white heroic is a little bit tricky because they can come out so fast, and if they manage to stick Cho Mano on their creature and name Protection from White and grow their creature up big enough where your burn can't stop it, things can get out of hand in a hurry. So you just have to be very careful. You cannot tap out against them. You got to keep the Galvanic Blast or Bolt options on the table as long as you can. And sometimes it might be worth not tapping out even when you don't have anything, even if you can just bluff and try to hold up and make them think that you do. It's a tricky matchup. A lot of it's just gold fishing. But yeah, the biggest thing is to not tap out and open up the ability for them to drop a Hyena Umbra or something else if you can possibly hold up, if their creature's still in range of being able to be bolted or Galvanic Blasted off the board. Boggles, again, you probably have a little bit of enchantment hate in your sideboard. You definitely want to bring that in. The Electrickery is really important too. A lot of it, again, it just comes down to gold fishing. Against Burn, we kind of talked about that when we went through the main deck. As far as you have some life gain options, you've got to really maximize value on every card you have in your deck that you can use to gain life. And Affinity we sort of talked about as well already, and I think that pretty well covers it. Against Mono Black, it's kind of the same thing as we talked about Blue Black, except Mono Black doesn't have counterspells. So, frankly, I'd rather play Mono Black than Blue Black if I'm piloting the Boros deck. And yeah, that's pretty well it. As far as is it Blitz or White Blue Tyler's Tribe combo, you just need to be sure you've got a boatload of removal, and that you really aggressively try to kill their few creatures that they do have. You can also jam your Palace Sentinels early because they're not running a lot of creatures, and the more cards that you can draw while they're trying to set up their combo, the better off you're gonna be. Alright guys, that covers everything on Kuldotha Boros for today. If you have any questions, just leave a comment, or if you have a request for a deck tech that you'd like to, or a deep dive that you'd like to see on a particular deck, let me know, as I don't really have any specific order that I'm doing these in. I just picked Kuldotha Boros because it's kind of been floating its way up in the metagame, and I like to cover the decks that are at the top of the metagame. Whatever happens with Kuldotha Boros, even if it drifts back down, just know it's a legitimate contender. This is a deck you could take into any tournament scene, and you should have, you've got a pretty good 50-50 matchup against a lot of the field, and even better matchups against some decks. So that's all, guys. Have a great day. Peace.